All right, everyone. Good to have you all. Good to be here. So good to have you with us tonight for tonight's program, Philadelphia, an early American dance city at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. My name is Justina Barrett. I'm the Chief Learning and Engagement Officer here at HSP, and we are delighted to have you here at 13th and Locust in Philadelphia and at home or wherever you are zooming in from on Zoom. Please do put where you're coming in from in the chat, and that will populate for us to see. HSP proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History. We have over 22 million documents, books, and graphic items that tell the stories of all Americans. We have particular emphasis in early American history, ethnic and minority groups, science and industry, the arts, which we'll be talking about tonight, and genealogical research. Tonight's talk is part of a newly developed series called Artists in the Archives, which intends to bring historians and artists into conversations around HSP's collections and documents and graphic items, exploring how creative practice reshapes archival research. One of our strategic themes and one of our strategic initiatives is to intentionally collect items that document what we call the soul of America, literary, performing, and visual arts. And as our collections grow, collections that are about artistic work and about the artists themselves continue to grow, we look forward to welcoming more artists into our reading room to do research and to learn how their research questions can help shape our research practice here at HSP. If you join us starting next week for our new exhibit, which opens on January 22nd, called Changing Faces of Independence, you will see on view a work by textile artist Sante Johnson, and she is developing a work that was inspired by the life and work of Frank Johnson, who I know you'll be talking about later tonight, and we have a lithograph of him out. That installation is part of a citywide project called Radical Americana that is being spearheaded by the Clay Studio. So exciting, busy times for all of us to be considering how historical inquiry can impact and affect our practice, whatever your practice is, and your work. So while you ponder that, I have a little bit of housekeeping, especially for the folks at home. This is a hybrid program, so we have both people in the room and people on Zoom. If you're viewing online, we do have closed captioning. You can click the CC button. We are recording tonight's program, and it will be sent to everybody who registered in a follow-up email. So if somebody else registered you, make sure you give us your email tonight at some point so you can get all of this good stuff. And we will have time for questions at the end, both in the room and on Zoom. Our virtual audience can go ahead and populate the Q&A anytime that something comes up throughout the program. And for our in-person audience, following the lecture, we invite you to continue to explore some of the documents that Lynn has helped us curate from our collection. It's just the tip of the iceberg, so there's a lot more for you to explore here at HSP. All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce our tonight's speaker. Dance historian Lynn Matluck Brooks is the Arthur and Catherine Shattuck Professor of Humanities Emerita at Franklin and Marshall College, where she founded and led the dance program for 34 years. Formerly editor of Dance Research Journal, Dance Chronicle, and thinkingdance.net, she has held competitive research grants and presents regularly at international conferences. She held a Mellon Fellowship here at HSP. We share fellowships with the library company next door back about 2017 and 18. And our fellowship application is live right now. It closes at the end of the month, hsp.org/fellowships. So if you're a researcher, if you're a graduate student, you're a postdoctorate, take a look at that and see if you want to come spend some time in our collection. Sorry, had to take that opportunity for that plug. Lynn is active in the cultural community, serving on many boards over the years, such as the World Dance Alliance, the Society for Dance History Scholars, the Congress of Research in Dance, the Dance Studies Association, and the Journal of Laban Bartaniev Movement Studies. As a dancer, she studied at the Martha Graham School of Contemporary Dance, among other places. She has choreographed many works for the Franklin and Marshall Dance Program and other groups, and performed and choreographed with Alonzo Castro Dance Theater in New York and the Grant Street Dance Company in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Lynn has also published many books and articles on her research into dancing in Golden Age Spain, 18th century Netherlands, and the early United States, which is what we'll be hearing about tonight. Brooks most recently edited Dance and Science in the Long 19th Century and is the author of Theaters of the Body, Dance and Discourse in Antebellum Philadelphia, which we have for sale here tonight. And we will be putting the link and a promo code in the chat for those folks at home. We'll also include that in the follow-up email. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Lynn Matluck Brooks.
Thank you, Justina. Thank you so much for this opportunity to chat with you all and to share some of the research that went into this book. As Sean, my editor from Temple University Press, knows, there's such a vast amount of material in here that you really are getting just one layer of it. So there's a lot more to say, and I hope those of you here will take a look at these documents, which are just so rich and beautiful, and which fed my research, among other sources. The access to the book online and the promo code is right here, and I'll show it again at the end, and it will be in the chat. My book was motivated by a number of questions, but tonight I'm going to be emphasizing 2 points. First, Philadelphia was a major dance city, theatrically and oh, sorry, there's something obscuring my text up there. There's something blocking it, but it was an important major dance city, theatrically and socially, is what that word says, in the early United States, shaping it culturally. And this involved individuals, works that were performed, and sites of performance. We'll be looking at some of those shortly. Second point I'll be emphasizing tonight is that dance engaged with vibrant discourses shaping the nation from the War of Independence to the Civil War, the antebellum period. The 4 discourses that I stress in my book are those engaging visual art, politics, literature, and science. And these are all interrelated. There are other discourses that feed in as well: music, religion, education. But these are the 4 that I emphasize throughout my book. And I'm stressing this because I just want to point out that dance was not only a source of entertainment and escape in the period. I think it was that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But dance was also a way of grappling with issues that were candescent at the time, and it is still that. Looking at a map of Philadelphia at the beginning of the antebellum period, we see that the city developed initially along the waterfront, the Delaware waterfront, although we all know that William Penn had a plan from Vine to what's now South Street, from the Delaware to the Schuylkill, for laying out the city, and yet the development actually hugged the waterfront and began slowly to move westward. North and south of those boundaries, Vine and what's now South Street, we see pretty much undeveloped land or rural pastoral environments. By 1860, and in 1861, spring of 1861, the Civil War will start. By 1860, we look at that map and it's a fully developed grid: north, south, east, west, and beyond the points that we see on this map. In other words, Philadelphia continued to be, from the colonial period through the antebellum period and until today, a major city for economic unfolding, industrialization, social development, political thought, and cultural unfolding. So turning to that cultural and social world, I'm starting with the Philadelphia City Dancing Assembly. If we remember that Philadelphia was the second city of the British Empire, in the colonial era, the second city after London. It's not a surprise to see that Philadelphia would be among the very first American what would become United States cities to establish a formal dancing assembly. This is a place for socialization, for showing off one's deportment, behavior, one's refinement, for meeting the right people, perhaps for doing a little business, certainly doing a little flirtation on the side. We see some Philadelphia Assembly tickets. You had to have a ticket to attend. You didn't just open the door and walk in. You had to be invited. You had to be a subscriber. And these are from the middle of the 18th century. In 1826, in the lower right, you'll see an image of a request for a ticket. People wanted to be part of this elite dancing assembly. And if they weren't included in the subscriber base or invited by a member, they had to request a ticket. What did those people look like when they were performing? We have an image of a high society ball from the 1820s or 30s here. And you see the lovely dress, the elegant deportment, the nice pointed feet of the dancers, the polite bows, the elegant conversation and gestures that would have been expected at a city dancing assembly ball. And these were, there was more demand for these tickets than there was space for dancing in the initial decades of the assembly. Of course, the elites were not the only people who were dancing by any means. So I'm just showing you a little bit about a few other places where dancing occurred. In what is now Washington Square, but was then actually just a potter's field, Southeast Square, a place where the poor, the indigent, those who died of infectious diseases would have been buried. Washington Square was, claims tell us, some current claims, was called Congo Square by the African-American community. This is where they had a burial ground and where those who were enslaved, Pennsylvania was a slaveholding state, even into the early 19th century, although there was a gradual abolition act at the end of the 18th century. The enslaved and the free African Americans would gather in what's now Washington Square or Congo Square. We have verbal descriptions of these gatherings to honor the departed, to socialize with others, to sing, to dance, to maintain traditions from Africa. We don't have images of that dancing from Philadelphia, but I am showing you one here from the Congo Square in New Orleans, a more famous site. And this is a later artist's imagination of what that dancing might have looked like. People of all classes, as I said, were dancing. In the upper right, we see an image based on a Krimmel drawing. We see an image of dancing at a country tavern, perhaps a tavern just on the outskirts of Philadelphia or some other major city. And we see here probably working class people enjoying themselves, socializing. A few seem to have had maybe a drink or two too many. And who's playing the music for them as they dance but an African-American fiddler? And this is very common that the music was provided even for dances that were primarily for white performers. Often the music was performed by African-American musicians. And this became one opportunity for seepage or exchange culturally between Black and white communities. Taverns were often sites of dancing, as well as commercial exchange, political conversation, socialization, dancing, music, all kinds of activities would have occurred at these taverns. And we see an early tavern, Penny Pot Tavern, which is right on the docks, the very vibrant docks of Philadelphia. And on this sheet of paper, if you look on the right-hand side of the paper and sideways, you see a drawing of a dancing woman. See a dancing girl there? In my thinking, that dancing girl was dancing at the Penny Pot Tavern. Not that we know this for a fact, but surely singing, dancing, and other socialization, sociability happened at the Penny Pot. We know for sure that dancing happened at the City Tavern because this is where the city dancing assembly sometimes met. So we know that that was also a site of dancing. And there are many other reports of taverns hosting social dancing, and some even that had small stages where performances might have been held. So I've just alluded to stages, and I'm going to turn now to Philadelphia's early theatrical history, about which I've written a lot in my earlier biography of John Durang, which is perhaps somewhere available out there. And John Durang was our first homegrown talent and professional dancer. He was born in Lancaster, my hometown right now, but his career unfolded primarily in Philadelphia, and he actually owned property on South Street. Was very, very proud of that fact. He was one of the performers at the first permanent, I have to put that in quote marks, the first permanent theater that was erected in Philadelphia, the Southwark Theater. It was actually illegal to perform dance or theater or opera or drama in Philadelphia in the 18th century. Remember, Philadelphia was a Quaker city, and performances of that sort were strictly outlawed. So the Southwark Theater cleverly positioned itself on the south side of South Street, just outside the reach of the Philadelphia Constabulary. So that is our first Philadelphia theater, roofed over theater, and John Durang was among the performers who trod those boards. As I said, he was primarily a dancer, and we see him here in his famous hornpipe in a watercolor that he drew himself, that he created himself. But he also was an actor, musician, scene painter, manager, man of all trades. Among his other trades was dancing master. How did he learn to do that? He learned largely from his partnership with Mr. Francis, William Bodley Francis, an English dancing master who was brought over in 1793 to populate the stages of the then new and most elegant Chestnut Street Theater. It opened a tad late because of a yellow fever epidemic. However, the theater was built and the company was in place. They had to open in Annapolis until the epidemic eased in Philadelphia. John Durang also performed at the Chestnut Street Theater eventually, and he formed a partnership with Mr. Francis, aside from their stage work, as a dancing master. They taught in partnership, and they taught the elegant behavior, deportment, steps, and dances that people at the City Dancing Assembly and others, any aspirants to social status, would have wanted to learn. They were teaching together primarily in the earliest decades of the 19th century. As we see in the list on the right-hand side, by 1850, that list of dancing masters is very long, and this is only a selection. The gentlemen, the messieurs, are on the top, and you'll notice a lot of those names are French, and that is in part because of immigrants fleeing the French Revolution and the unrest in the French Caribbean, and coming to Philadelphia and other United States cities, where to keep themselves alive, to find a living, some of them taught dancing. The list below shows some ladies, dancing mistresses. Some of them were wives, daughters, sisters of these dancing masters, but some of them taught independently. Women were also very active on the stages of Philadelphia, particularly from the 1820s through the end of the antebellum period and beyond. But my book ends in 1860. And here I'm just showing you a smattering of some of these ballet dancers. There are many, many more names that appear in my book, starting with L'Incomparable Ravel Company in 1827. This was an acrobatic and balletic troupe, family-based, but they embraced performers who were not all Ravel family members. And they did acrobatics, pantomimes, and ballets. And these movement-based arts were closely aligned in this period. Early on in the antebellum period, Madame Celeste appeared with one of the very first groups of French dancers to do ballet on Philadelphia stages, and she remained a perennial favorite in Philadelphia throughout the early 19th century. She became a pantomime star as well. One of her competitors was Madame Augusta. Both of these dancers were French trained. Celeste, we know, was trained at the Paris Opera, at the Academy of the Paris Opera. So these were dancers who knew what they were doing. They were inspirations for young Americans who wanted to appear themselves on the stage as ballet dancers, not just as interlude comic dancers. Among these, Philadelphia, again, takes the leadership with Mary Ann Lee, born in Philadelphia into a theatrical family, who made her debut on Philadelphia stages at the age of 13, dancing together with La Petite Augusta Maywood, born in New York, but she made her debut and most of her youthful career in Philadelphia. You'll notice that there's a preponderance of La Bayadère, Le Dieu et la Bayadère on this page. This was a very important work in the period and one of Celeste's star vehicles. And so we see our young American dancers also made their debuts in that work. Unfortunately, with a black line across her face here over on the upper right, is another French dancer, Ursa Matthias. She was announced as a Russian star, but actually she was born in Lyon and trained in the French ballet, but she did make her achieve stardom in St. Petersburg until she joined the Ravel Company and married one of the Ravel brothers and performed ballet along with the Ravel troupe of acrobats and ballet dancers. There were gentlemen on the stages, but often they were also behind the scenes. And here we see Charles Durang, the eldest son of John Durang, who became a very important, not only performer, but stager, choreographer, prompter, which was the word for director in this period. And he wrote a highly significant history of the Philadelphia stage that anybody who does any research in early 19th century American theater must use. You must mine Charles Durang's history of the Philadelphia theater, remarkably rich source. Another Philadelphian who became not only an important performer, but stager and choreographer was George Washington Smith, also born in Philadelphia. We think he made his initial appearances as a hornpipe dancer, eventually danced with the company of the renowned ballerina Fanny Elsler in the United States, and then had an independent career as a choreographer and stager. Musicians were, of course, important to dancers, and I'm just highlighting two of them here. Alexander Reinagel was the music director at the Chestnut Street Theater, where Mr. Francis and John Durang all performed. He directed operas and musical concerts, wrote the music for all the dramatic stagings and for dance, and he also wrote dance works that Mr. Francis choreographed. Frank Johnson, of a somewhat later period, is another extremely important artist in early Philadelphia. Francis Johnson was a musician of wide accomplishment, primarily known for his horn playing, but also a violinist, a pianist. He taught every instrument that was available. He was the most published composer in early America. He led bands and orchestras. He brought his all-black band to Europe, and he wrote a lot of dance music and the steps for some of his dances. So we can also consider him a choreographer. And I'll just give a shout out to Brent White and Lauren Putty White, who are also working with Francis Johnson's material and will be doing a performance in April. Look forward to that at Christchurch Neighborhood House featuring Johnson's work. So we have a lot of ballet on early American stages. I hope you've already recognized that fact, but that was not the only kind of dancing that was appearing on these stages. At the same time, another kind of dance was appearing, exploding on the stages, just as ballet also was becoming a dominant dance form, and that was blackface minstrelsy. It was not only dance, music, humor, drama, satire, burlesque, but everything was physicalized. And the dancer, this is well recorded by minstrels of the period, the dancer was the star of the show. If the dancer threatened to quit, the whole troupe was going to fall apart. Then I think it was Frank Dumont said, the whole troupe would get down on bended knee, begging that dancer to stay with the troupe. Every blackface minstrel had to know how to dance, even if he wasn't the star. They were all men, white men, who would perform in blackface, and as we see here, also in travesty. Many of the figures that you'll see on the central image look like female dancers, but they're actually white men in blackface and travesty. I'm showing you the whiteface version of just three of the minstrels that I've selected because they are closely associated with Philadelphia, and then the blackface associations that you can add to their resumes. Frank Brower was a very famous early blackface minstrel and a dancer, and we see him in a representation of him dancing and playing the bones, kind of castanets. Frank Dumont, who was a later Philadelphia blackface minstrel and historian of minstrelsy. Again, I used his work extensively. I mined it in my own history of Philadelphia blackface minstrelsy, which you'll find in my book. And these are from his scrapbook, the images that you see in the central part of this slide. Samuel Sanford came to Philadelphia with a minstrel troupe and decided, this is the place I'm going to make my permanent home. And he built the first permanent, again, I have to put that in quotation marks, theater for what he called Ethiopian opera. Not just him. That is how blackface minstrelsy was known at the time. Ethiopian burlesque, Ethiopian opera. And as I was explaining to some of our guests here earlier, Ethiopia was a stand-in for Africa at the time. So Ethiopian simply meant, in the minds of these blackface minstrels, African derived. And I talk about whether there was African derivation in any of this material in my book. I'm jumping back to ballet now because I do want to point out that balletic works were prevalent on our stages. We did not have to wait for the Russians to appear in the early 20th century. We had all the great works that were being shown in Europe on American stages and sometimes danced by American ballet dancers. And some of the playbills that I'm showing here, you can also take a look at in the display on the tables afterward. A few of the important works I've alluded to, Le Dieu et la Bayadère, which is a predecessor of the more famous La Bayadère by Petipa that many of us have seen. La Sylphide, a work that is still part of the ballet repertoire today. This would have been an earlier rendition, but the same libretto. Jocko, the Brazilian Ape, a very famous work in its time by the renowned choreographer Filippo Taglioni, father of Marie Taglioni. And Jocko deals with issues of humanity and human ranking and raciality and power that, as we will see, were dominant in the discourses of this time in antebellum Philadelphia and beyond. We also have an image at the top right of an English ballet spectacle pantomime, Cherry and Fair Star, which premiered at Covent Garden in the early 1820s. And by 1825, it's in Philadelphia, staged by none other than Charles Durang. The two figures you see on the stage representing Cherry and Fair Star are supposed to be, well, first we think they're a brother and a sister. Later we learn that they're actually cousins, and that means that they can get married for the happy ending. But in fact, these are both female figures. So we have blackface minstrels dancing in travesty as women, and we have white ballet dancers dancing in travesty as men. So there's a lot of crossover among these forms, which continuously astonished me as I was doing this research. On the bottom right, I'm showing you the libretto cover for Il Birichino di Parigi by the renowned La Scala choreographer Domenico Ronzani, who formed the first ballet troupe to appear on the stages of the Academy of Music. And we also have a playbill for Il Birichino over here on the tables. So yes, we have the great Italian dancers from the 19th century were also over here in the United States. And I just want to say, I'm not the first one to discover this, but Enrico Cecchetti, all our ballet dancers in here will know that name, made his debut in Philadelphia at the age of 7, dancing with the Ronzani Ballet. We do have some renown in dance history. Some places that were important in the history of dance. I've already mentioned the Chestnut Street Theater, considered the most elegant and well-appointed theater in the United States at the time of its opening in the late 18th century, in the 1790s. The Walnut Street Theater, of course, we still have with us. It started as a circus before it was roofed over and became a main stage. And circuses themselves remained important sites of ballet performance. I've already pointed out the connection between acrobatics, pantomime, and ballet. Circus acts and ballet were perfectly compatible in this period, and circuses like Welch's Hippodrome here in Philadelphia featured a lot of ballet, and it was a great place for ballet dancers, aspirants, to get their starts, as were the summer gardens like DeVos Hall at Broad Street and McCarran's Gardens closer to the Schuylkill, where in the heat of a Philadelphia summer, we all know about that, you could go out into the gardens, into McCarran's Gardens, you could have an ice cream, you could walk under the shade of the trees, and you could dance and watch performances on the stage. Again, a great place for an aspiring dancer to get his or her start. And both blackface minstrels and ballet dancers appeared on stages in summer gardens and circuses, and main stages like the Chestnut and the Walnut. I've already alluded to Sanford's Opera House, which opened in 1853, Sanford's Ethiopian Opera House. And here, the star of the show, the American Academy of Music. Note it's the American Academy of Music. It's not the Broad Street Academy of Music. It's not the Philadelphia Academy of Music. It's the American Academy of Music. It was intended to lead America's cultural life. And that is what is stated in the prospectus and charter, which we also have a copy of on these tables here. This will be America's leading opera house. It will be the stronghold of refined entertainment in the Americas. You will recognize the Academy of Music in the image in the upper left. And we have a wonderful set of images that show us the stage in the Academy of Music, both as the audience would have seen it. I'm sitting in my seat and I'm looking at the proscenium arch and I see the ballerinas on that stage. But in the image central to this slide and the cover of my book, we are on the stage with the ballerinas and we're looking out into the hall. And I think any of us who've been in the Academy of Music will say, oh yes, that's the Academy of Music. Still is. The Academy of Music was founded to host ballet, opera, and high art drama like Shakespeare. That was the intention of the gentlemen. And if you look at the names in this prospectus, well-established families in Philadelphia, they wanted this as a house of refined entertainment. American Academy of Music featuring French ballet, Italian opera, and English drama. There's an irony there. And that brings me to some of the discourses that were vibrant in the antebellum period and that I feature in my book. In the 4 main body chapters of my book, I kind of march decade by decade from 1820 through 1850, and I link each of those decades with a discourse. Of course, all of the discourses interpenetrated one another, and no discourse was limited to any one decade, but it was my motive of organizing the vast amount of material that I came across. I used Edward W. Clay's Lessons in Dancing, which he published in 1828, as a guide for my second chapter. He was an artist, a lithographer, and a cartoonist in Philadelphia. He later moved to New York. He later lost his eyesight and had to stop drawing. This is an early work, and we will see that he's already quite a sharp commentator socially, and he would become only more sharp and more difficult to stomach as his work evolved. I see his 8 etchings and Lessons in Dancing as an establishment of hierarchy socially that he's demonstrating through bodily comportment and dance. We start at the top with the City Dancing Assembly. In a step any dancer will recognize, a balancé. And we see the elegant dress and deportment and bodily carriage of our dancers. Those same dancers are, or might be them or friends, members of the same elite class, at a fancy ball. Fancy in this period meant dress up, masquerade. So this was a masquerade ball, highly contentious in the period. The Quakers, whom I've already alluded to, discountenance dancing of any sort, but if you were in masquerade, it was beyond tolerance, because not only were you dancing, which was immoral, but you were obscuring your true identity, and who knows what you might do in that case. So the fancy balls, we have over here a small screed, a pamphlet that was written by a representative of thousands decrying an elite fancy ball that perhaps was the one that E.W. Clay is depicting in this image. How did those dancers learn to do the steps that they were performing? Well, perhaps at Mr. Bonnafon, French dancing master, at his dancing academy. And here we see an image of one of his cotillion parties, which he would have held so that the dancers at his academy could practice their steps. Of course, what are they doing? How are they dancing? They're doing a waltz. Anyone who knows the history of the waltz knows that it was a highly immoral dance in its day, much decried by mothers and preachers, because the man and the woman held each other with both arms. They were chest to chest. They were whirling around on the floor, their legs interlaced. The woman might lose her capacity to remain upright and fall into her partner's arms. And yet this is what we see demonstrated in E.W. Clay's third image here. The fourth image that I'm showing you here is E.W. Clay's demonstration of a pas de deux at the Chestnut Street Theater, a ballet dance, in other words. And we think this may have been Madame Hutin, one of the very first ballet dancers to appear from France in the United States, and her partner, probably, I think this was Monsieur Achille. And if I had that ballet technique at this point in my life, I'd be delighted. Lovely second position extension, very elegant releve, beautifully straight and aligned legs, charming port-bras, and they are dressed, interestingly enough, rather similarly to the dancers in the elite fancy ball. I think this is another comment by E.W. Clay talking about the pretension of the elites. And here we see that Madame Hutin's legs are obscured by what are called petticoat trousers, because had her legs been actually seen in their true form, who knows, the women might have fainted and the men would have lost control. We will find out that those petticoat trousers quickly disappeared from ballerina's legs. Dancers on stages, of course, are working class people, and here we have three images of working class dancers in E.W. Clay's depiction. Again, there's a lot of humor in these depictions. The first one shows a country dance. As we know, Philadelphia was surrounded by a vibrant countryside, rural farms and small towns that were full of activity. And many of the occupants were Quakers in the surrounding areas as well as within Philadelphia. Who is dancing in our country town? Quakers. Naughty behavior, but they look like they're having an awfully good time. The lady is trying very hard to keep her shawl in place over her chest, but her skirts are flying up above her ankles, and the gentleman is just having such a good time. He has a grin from ear to ear. The middle image, we see a jig in Taylor's Alley, and I'm assuming this is a tailor and his lady, both extravagantly dressed. I don't know how they can keep those hats on as they sway from side to side, having a really good time in their less than elegant dance. The image on the bottom right shows a sailor. This costume would instantly have been recognized by anybody in this period as a sailor's uniform. We have a sailor dancing with his lady. Perhaps she was the barmaid at the Penny Pot Tavern. We see her, she's wearing her apron, pops out of her from behind the bar, and they're dancing together in perhaps a hornpipe, just like John Durang choreographed for the stage. We've been through 7 images, and we have descended socially from the elites to the working class. At the very bottom, we have a depiction of an African fancy ball. There is so much to unpack here. I dedicate many pages to this image in my book. And here we see E.W. Clay depicting African-American residents of Philadelphia, highly overdressed, packed into their clothing, which does no favors to their figures, exaggerating their physicality in ways that are very unflattering, trying to do an elegant dance, but failing to do so. Knees are bent, they're not quite getting up onto the balls of their feet, fingers are splayed, and unlike any of the other images, these two dancers are depicted back to back. E.W. Clay is one of the figures who has been pointed at as developing minstrelsy on the page, before even minstrelsy appeared on the stage. And he became increasingly virulent in his depictions and increasingly theatrical of not just of dancers, but particularly of African Americans. racial cartooning, which we will look at again shortly. This brings us, of course, to the political discourses that were candescent in the period. And I focus in chapter 3 on the 1830s on two population groups that were fighting for status, for rights, for access to citizenship, women and African Americans. And I focus on them because I was struck by the fact that the stages of this period were dominated by women dancing and delineations, and that was the word that was used in the period, delineations of African Americans. Why was that? Well, maybe our look at political discourse will tell us why. Starting with the women, we see a few images here of how proper women should look. How should a proper woman be depicted? Well, she's with her family, the protection of her husband, with her child, or if she's a young woman, she's with a group of other maidens, very properly dressed, covered from neck to wrist to the floor, and engaging in polite conversation and embroidery. That's just fine for a young lady. We see a very proper Philadelphian on the upper right, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker activist, a phenomenally inspiring figure, in fact, in this period. Unfortunately, again, we have a stripe across the top of her head, but she's wearing a little white bonnet that completely obscures her hair. Her shawl is crossed over her shoulders, and she would have been in a long gown that covered her to the floor and to her wrists. Lucretia Mott certainly was a very proper lady and a convinced Quaker. She was also a feminist who would brook no opposition and a fervent anti-slavery activist, a really phenomenally inspiring figure. We saw how women are depicted as proper ladies. How are they depicted in ballet? So here we're jumping again into the visual art depictions, and we see a very different way of looking at women and of considering women's bodies. These dancers are utterly revealed. You can see right through their skirts to their legs. In fact, one critic of the period described ballerinas' skirts as lace fig leaves, which anybody from that period and from ours understands the reference. Some of them are depicted as either falling out of their bodices or not even having bodices. Again, we have a lot of E.W. Clay up here, and if you look at Madame Lecomte in the upper right, she is bare-breasted, and her hair is loose, falling all over her chest. I assure you, she did not dance this way on any Philadelphia stage. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. However, in Clay's mind, she might as well have done so. We again see Madame Hutin in her petticoat trousers, and you see that none of the other dancers are depicted wearing them. And again, a critic of the day said, well, the mamas demanded the petticoat trousers, but the daughters soon decided otherwise in the theaters, and they disappeared. And so we see the dancers' legs, their bodices, their arms, their necks, their vibrant, extended movement out into space, and they're on stages earning their livings through their bodies. I don't have to tell you the associations that, of course, were brought to that status. The political discourse of this period, of course, also involved race. It's a highly candescent image in this period. I've already alluded to the racial cartooning that I'm going to show you some more of in a moment, but I want to point out that Philadelphia was a site of a vibrant, powerful, impressive African-American leadership. These were intellectuals, these were wealthy business people, these were artists, teachers, thinkers. The Historical Society has a tremendous amount of material on them, and I'm showing you just a few of these figures here. Sarah Mapps Douglas, educator, artist, and scientist. James Forten, there was just a wonderful exhibit on him at the Museum of the American Revolution. Harriet Forten Purvis, James Forten's daughter, an activist and women's rights fighter who was a shoulder to shoulder with Lucretia Mott in these movements. Robert Douglas Jr., who was an artist and daguerreotypist. This is the early period of photography. And I have already shown you Frank Johnson. We have one of these images here on display, and here is another early image of Francis Johnson with one of his beautiful horns. And you also see a piece of music that he wrote and dedicated to Mrs. Rush of the renowned Philadelphia Rush family. He performed for the most elite families, militias, dancing assemblies, and theaters of Philadelphia, despite a population like that included Frank Johnson, James Fortune, Harriet Purvis, and so on. The racial cartooning of this period was prevalent and very frequently featured dancing. Why this was? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about science momentarily, but looking at the body was a way of determining human status at the time, and nothing reveals the body more fully than the dance. And so we see a lot of this racial cartooning bringing dancing to the fore. Dancing or masquerading, costuming. We see an artist other than E.W. Clay in the upper left here, William Wood Thackeray, I'm not sure how you pronounce that name, whose depiction brings out the scientific discourse that I'll be talking about shortly, which is on the right-hand side of the image, we see what he calls a black dandy aping, and this is the word he uses in the text here, aping a white dandy, while he is being aped by a monkey all the way on the very right-hand side of the image in a windowsill. So this is giving us a hint at the kind of scientific classification and hierarchies that were informing the understandings of bodies in this period, including bodies on the stages. The rest of the slide is dominated by images. I'm showing you images by Edward W. Clay, again featuring dancing in two of these images, and all of these show either the simian, primate-like views of the African body in his mind, or the failure of African Americans, no matter how hard they try to achieve the kind of refinement of comportment, display, dance, courtesy that they tried so hard to show. It was an impossibility in E.W. Clay's depictions, and the dance is a way to highlight those failures. In chapter 4 of my book, associated with the 1840s, I draw on literary themes, and these are all works that were either published in Philadelphia in the 1840s or were about Philadelphia. Every one of these literary works, The Mysteries of Philadelphia, The Quaker City, or The Monks of Monk Hall, Belle of Prairie Eden, T.S. Arthur's The Maiden, every one of these associates dancing with immorality. Dance becomes a metonym for a failure to achieve social status. And even if the best raised young woman goes to a theater and sees a dancer like Madame Celeste or Fanny Elsler, and they're both mentioned in this work, she's lost. No nice gentleman will take her out to dance, to date, certainly not to marry. That was T.S. Arthur's warning in The Maiden. And all of these works depict dancing together with intemperance, with immorality, with gambling, with violence. That was one view of dancing in the 1840s that was quite dominant, but it was not the only view. And I want to bring out the fact that just in this very period, we also see the emergence of what I think of as dance criticism, which is a kind of a literary effort in which I have engaged for much of my life. In the early 19th century, a Philadelphia critic said, "Oh, don't bother trying to criticize ballet. Dancing defies criticism." But within a couple of decades, we start seeing the critics able to look at and articulate what they're seeing and evaluate it. Not just facial and bodily beauty draws their attention. Yes, that is there, but also they can evaluate techniques, they can evaluate expressivity, virtuosity, they can compare dancers' strengths, Celeste to Augusta, for example, and they can note when a dancer fails to meet standard, because by 1842, one critic could say, "Oh, I am a connoisseur. I know how to evaluate dancing." So this is a positive literary development in the period, and there were others. Madame Celeste, for example, commissioned works specifically for her to perform pantomime works. She commissioned dramatic works in which she herself was featured, thus increasing the dramatic literature of the period. My fifth chapter talks about science as its guiding principle, although science permeates the book. And it's primarily dedicated to the 1850s, my fifth chapter. And I'm just showing you two of the scientists from the period who were at the forefront of the biological classifications, systemization that shaped the understandings of humanity, human ranking in this period. We now call these scientists race scientists, but at the time they were craniologists, ethnologists. They had reputable names. And all these two figures here were Philadelphia educated, University of Pennsylvania, big source of medical education in that period. And Samuel George Morton was also a president of the Academy of Natural Sciences. And he was a founder of the science of craniology. How do you measure intelligence? Well, you get skulls from all over the world, you fill them with gunshot, and you weigh them, and then you know which skulls are bigger and which skulls are smaller. And of course, the bigger skulls are the more intelligent people, and the smaller skulls are the less intelligent people. And I bet you can even guess how those rankings turned out in his judgments. A follower of Samuel George Morton was Josiah Clark Nott. Actually, he's a Southerner, but he was educated at the University of Pennsylvania and practiced medicine for a time in Philadelphia. He took up Morton's charge. Morton died in 1851, and Nott took up his work. He consciously was a follower, advertised himself as a follower of Morton in the systemization and classification of human beings and our primate relatives. And again, you won't be surprised to learn that Nott, like Morton, evaluated how could this have happened, that those of his race, gender, and ethnicity happened to be at the top of the ranking, and other groups happened to be below that. Just worked out that way. Similarly, women were in the scopes of the scientists in this period. These are both University of Pennsylvania educated scientists. I think they both were actually professors at Penn or at Jefferson, and were prominent Philadelphia obstetricians. It was the late 18th, early 19th centuries when obstetrics became a male doctor's field, wresting women's health out of the hands of midwives, who happened to have delivered all the babies in the rest of the world for the millennia preceding that period. But suddenly, by the late 18th to the early 19th century, we needed men to do this job. And those imbecile, and that was a word that was used, I think, by Meigs, that those imbecile women had to be swept away. And thus we see the emergence of the field of obstetrics. And these doctors wrote treatises contributing to the literary output of the time, in which they explained why men were those who could hold political power, those who could vote, those who could hold property, why they had to control the women and the African descended people in their charges, because the men had the intellectual power. We know this from the shot that was weighed out of those heads, those crania that Morton was weighing. And one of my favorite lines that I came across in my research by Charles Meigs is his claim that women's heads are just too small for intellect, just big enough for love. How could you do better? And of course, the images that prove these points are artistic images. The Apollo Belvedere, of course, no human man really looks like the Apollo Belvedere, and the Venus de Milo. This sense of systemization, of classifying human beings was hardening in this period. We were approaching the Civil War. It's the 1850s. Racial rankings, social rankings are becoming harder and harder in this period. And I make the argument in my book that this was represented in the kinds of theaters that emerged in this period. Sam Sanford's Ethiopian Opera House opened in 1853. featuring for the working class, and I need to stress, I didn't do this earlier, but blackface minstrelsy emerged from the working class and was meant to entertain the working class man. And Sam Sanford founded the first permanent Ethiopian opera house in Philadelphia in 1853. Already the fundraisers for the Academy of Music were busy at that point, trying to get the American Academy of Music built. They succeeded by 1857, which is when the Academy opened. And here I'm showing you both buildings, both stages, and the kinds of dancing that they would have featured, the kinds of bodies and the kinds of embodied dance techniques that you would have seen on those stages. In this final slide of images, I've just put side by side some of the ballet dancers and the proper social dancers with the blackface minstrelsy dancers and minstrelsy on the page as well as on the stage, so that you see these two dominant types of dance that struck me as I was doing this research as filling Philadelphia stages. I should just point out that when I started this research, I thought I was documenting ballet in early America. That was my goal. I kept coming across blackface minstrel images and thinking, oh, I just don't want to see these. And then I realized, oh, but that is the story. That is the story. And that's why I have these two sets of images side by side here. Much, much more of this information, of course, is available in my book. And the website and the promo code are available to you there, and I hope you will dig into it. And there's a lot of humor, I have to say. I brought a little bit in today, but there were some stories that I came across that were almost beyond belief in this story. So there's some fun in it, as well as some very provocative information. And before I open the floor to questions, I just want to acknowledge one of my colleagues here, Emily Hawk, who was my very first research assistant at Franklin and Marshall College when I started doing this research, and was here at the Historical Society and the Library Company when I had that realization of, oh, blackface minstrelsy, I think I can avoid it. So I think Emily remembers that moment and looking at each other face to face and saying, okay, here we go. So Emily, thank you so much. And then I had 3 other student assistants in other years after Emily. And Emily is now Dr. Emily Hawk and teaching at Dickinson College. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lynn. That was incredible. Let's have another round of applause at home if you're here, and for pulling an incredible research project into a 45-minute talk and just sharing so many graphic images and helping us walk through them in such an interesting and deep critical way. So do we have any questions in the room? And I know we're waiting for folks at home. If you want to put them in the Q&A, we will get yours as well. Oh, and we need to use the mic because folks at home won't be able to hear you.
I actually have 2 questions and centuries apart from each other. The only reference to the dancing in Washington Square, Congo Square, I've ever seen is that one in John Fanning Watson.
Right.
No other source. Have you ever found anything other than that references that dancing, the blacks dancing in?
Well, I don't know if you know I'm not going to get the first name, but the last name is Steptoe. Terry, you know who I'm talking about? He's a poet, Lamont Steptoe. He's actually a current Philadelphia poet, and he has written an entire book, a small book, actually, I should say, of poems about Congo Square. And he talks about that dancing, which seems to have become a story that is passed through the African-American community. Where does it come from? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've encountered that too. It's oral history or traditional lore. Mm. But the only actual written reference is in that John Fanning Watson.
As far as I know, that's the case. There's certainly other description of African-American dancing. There's a lot of it, and I bring that up as well in my book.
And then minstrelsy kind of fell out of favor nationally around the turn of the 20th century, but remained really popular in Philadelphia much longer than that. Do you have any, I know that's not your specific area or era, but for some reason, minstrelsy remained popular here much longer than it did elsewhere in the country. I'm wondering if you have any.
I stopped at 1860s.
Right.
And of course, Philadelphians were mummers, and the Philadelphians like to dress up, and that might have, been part of it. The Dumont minstrelsy material is fascinating to read, and he was writing in the later 19th century. And his argument is that blackface minstrelsy is really clowning. It comes out of the circus. We have white-faced clowns and we had black-faced clowns. And that's one of the arguments that he makes. Does that have anything to do with Philadelphia's love of blackface minstrelsy? But I want to make another point. When I was doing my my fellowship here, the fellows would get together, maybe it was weekly or every couple of weeks, and present their work to one another in a group, which was fabulous opportunity. And I was talking about this material in its early days of its unfolding. And one of the other fellows her mother was Canadian. And her mother, she reported, she said, it's embarrassing for me to tell you this, but in the 1950s, my mother's elementary school I think it was Edmonton in Canada, their annual fundraiser was a blackface minstrel show. And her mother talked about it. So I don't know how unique Philadelphia was in its
It just had a lot of minstrel houses still going in the city long after the other, all around the country. They all had turned to vaudeville.
Okay.
But in Philadelphia, for some reason, the minstrel house is still,
Interesting. You can still find on YouTube, there are movies from the mid 20th and early to mid 20th century that have blackface shows in them. It's just, whoa. Or there were when I was looking at it. Maybe they've been pulled down since.
Oh, and one last thing, that image of the Southwark Theater, the little building next to it is still there. If you go to South Street, it's
Fourth?
well, it's right above 4th Street, or what's the name? I forget the name. It's a little west of 4th Street. That little house that you look at it now, it's that same exact house in that illustration.
I will be there very soon. Thank you. Thank you.
That the National Park Service on their website about Washington Square mentions that was a potter's field and that Black people gathered there to protect their burial.
Yes.
The interment of their relatives and neighbors, et cetera. And somewhere, because I've been involved with Lynn, read the book, by the way, which is so readable, and you dream you want to go back just for a day to see what Philadelphia was like at that point. But somewhere along the way, one of the doctors, I don't know if it was Rush at Pennsylvania Hospital, complained to his son or someone in a letter that the Black people were, obstructing their ways to get bodies out for study in medicine.
Yes.
But anyway, just a little note on that.
Yes, that is known, that the African-American community protected those grave sites because the medical students were digging around in that potter's field, figuring, who cares if we take exhume some skeletons for our anatomical studies? But the African-American community said, we care. You're not touching these. Yeah.
Okay, I have a few questions from the Zoom. I'm not sure that we're going to get to all of them, but there are some really interesting ones. Jean asked, did ballet continue at Chestnut Street Theater into the early 20th century, or did it only appear at the American Academy?
I didn't hear the first part.
Did ballet continue at Chestnut Street Theater into the early 20th century, or did it only appear at the American Academy?
Well, there was ballet at every theater, every circus, even on tavern stages. Somebody's going to get up in point shoes and toddle across the stage. The Chestnut Street Theater was gone by the middle of the 19th century. It burned down. It burned down 3 times, and that was the last one. And so it was gone. The last years of the Chestnut Street Theater, Charles Durang writes about it with heartsick that it had turned into a very low-class hall. It had lost the stature that it held when he was a young man growing up as a child of the theater. His father dancing on the stage, and his university was backstage at the Chestnut Street Theater, where all the greatest tragedians of the age performed and the greatest ballet dancers. So the theater itself was gone by the mid 19th century. The Walnut was a very important ballet hall in its time. And the Arch Street Theater, I didn't even mention that. A lot of ballet was at the Arch Street Theater. Ballet was everywhere. It wasn't always presented as a full-length work, but ballet was very frequently featured as the interlude entertainment between the main act, maybe a Shakespearean play, and a farce that might close the theater evening out. These were 5-hour evenings. The stage was never empty. In between, the curtain would be closed, and at the front, on the apron of the stage, a ballet dancer might come out and do a pas seul. Or a hornpipe dancer might come out and do a hornpipe. Or a black-faced minstrel might come out and do a breakdown. So there was ballet everywhere, and it really intermixed it was part of the fabric of entertainment at the time. Yes, there was an effort to put ballet on the refined stage of the Academy of Music. And yes, black-faced minstrelsy was dominant in the working class theaters, but they were never entirely segregated by any means. And something that I do talk about in the book is the crossover of themes between balletic works and black-faced minstrelsy works, including themes that deal with questions of freedom and race and women's rights. These appeared on both sides of those stages. It's just mind-boggling, frankly, even still for me.
We have a robust audience on Zoom, and so I'm going to take one more question in the room, and then we're going to get a few more from Zoom,
Okay.
because we could all stick around and ask her questions after the webinar. So one more in the room.
Thank you. Really great talk. And I like how you linked the development of dance to broader movements going on in discourses. One of the things I'm aware of in the visual arts and in interior design that was going on in this period was a movement from sort of emulating European kind of decor and arts to the formation of a more distinctly American identity. You mentioned dances, ballroom dances, right? And waltz and quadrille and ballet, all of which that seemed to be taken from France and Europe and England. Was there any movement to the creation of something distinctly American?
That's a great question. It's very, very interesting because there were different ways of doing this. For example, Mr. Francis was not getting the reaction he wanted to some of his choreographed works until he did one that had an American theme, and it had to do with the Mexican War. And he did a ballet with the dancers. I mean, it sounds like the Rockettes. You know, they had letter boards, and they would get out there and they would do their formations, and they would spell the name of this general and the name of this hero of the Mexican War. And the audience would just went crazy. And he realized, he said, "Oh, this is the way to do that." And then he started choreographing for his dancing academy. He started choreographing cotillions with the names of the first American battleships, some of which were built here in Philadelphia. So the Chesapeake and the Constitution, he started doing quadrilles named after those battleships. However, were the steps uniquely American? No, he was using the same steps that would have been done at an assembly in Bath or London, at Almack's. So it was more the theme than the actual material, except for blackface minstrelsy. That, friends, was our contribution. That was the American contribution to the theater. And that was how it was advertised. I mean, that's how it was understood in some of the literary discourses I discuss. We have American art. We have American poetry and music. And there it is. And when the blackface troops went to Europe, they were huge hits. In fact, Queen Victoria had command performances of these blackface troops at the palace. Loved them. So yes, and it's a really complicated and in some cases heartrending story. And I should mention also that when Francis Johnson with his all-black band went to Europe, he played minstrel tunes there. Why did he do that? Was he reclaiming those tunes as African-American material? Or was he simply bowing to popular demand? You're playing American music, that's what we want to hear. That's a question. Maybe Brent White can answer that for us. That would be really interesting to know.
Okay, we are going to take two more from the Zoom. Bear with me because this one's a little bit long. So Garam says, I really appreciated how you situated dance in Antebellum Philadelphia within broader discourses of power, hierarchy, and citizenship, and how you connected ballet and blackface minstrelsy within the same urban performance landscape. You mentioned that you initially resisted those images, but came to see that that is a story. From an educator's perspective, when teaching this material today, where do you draw the line between critical analysis and unintentionally repeating its harms in the classroom?
Well, fortunately, I had just retired when I when I had my fellowship, so I didn't have to worry about teaching this. But yes, I am still sharing it. You know, it is our history. If we deny it, we're failing to acknowledge what our history is. So I don't see any reason to avoid it utterly, though I have to admit I wanted to initially, but you can tell the story of this nation if you don't include the issues that were eating us up and tearing us apart. And that is, of course, what happened in 1861. And it was already clear by the end of the 1850s where this was going. These issues were ripping the nation asunder, and they were showing up on our stages. And I don't see how we can avoid addressing them. I think you have to address them with honesty, with nuance, with perspective. But there they were. So I don't know if I have an answer to that. We can have a lot of discussions about this. I don't have a pronouncement to make. I'm sorry.
Okay, we will end with one more question, an interesting one. Was there an artist living district in Philadelphia where dancers may have lived?
That is an interesting question. You know, when I did my work on Golden Age Seville, I actually was able to identify a barrio in Seville where those who produced the dances in the processions tended to live. But the troops that were coming through here were largely itinerant troops that traveled all through the country, and many of them involved Europeans. And so they were just here temporarily, staying in hotels or lodging houses. I do know where John Durang lived. He lived at 2nd and South Street. He tells us that. But whether that was a typical neighborhood for performers, that's a really interesting question, and that would be a great research topic. So if somebody is looking for an article topic or a dissertation theme, you've got it.
Thank you again, Lynn. Thank you again for our folks at home and for our folks in the room. I think it's a great invitation to dive into our research, hsp.org. Our catalog is discover.hsp.org, and start doing some of this work yourself, either at home or here in the library, in the reading room. Thank you for showing up tonight. Again, both in the room and on Zoom. Just by showing up, you are supporting this work. Spread the word. hsp.org/enews is our newsletter. We've got a great year for the semi-quincentennial planned. That's really looking at 250 years, not just 1776, but bringing the past in conversation with us today. I think your talk it was an absolute setting up of that. How do we wrestle with these things today? How do we, from our different perspectives, we're not all academic historians, how do we approach these works? And so thank you for getting us started. And I invite the folks in the room to come take a look. And again, have a wonderful evening for all of you at home. Thank you so much.
And do